topic today is you know, they come up with good names for the session, but we're really talking about extending the spectrum of DOCSIS and the impact that that's going to have on the cable network and customer experience long term. So our first speaker today is John Chapman. He's the CTO of the Cable BU and a Cisco fellow. He's started in, 96, I think, with the starting the Cable BU at Cisco. Been involved in every version of DOCSIS, real or imaginary, since then, and is been one of the real stalwarts of the cable industry and one of this cable TV pioneers. So with that, let me introduce John, and we'll get this show on the road.
Thank you, Reverend Jeff. So hallelujah to ESD. Let's get rolling here. So that didn't work. That didn't work. It doesn't work either.
It's angry. That's all right.
We'll just stay on the first slide.
We'll take it out.
There we go. Alrighty, so I'm going to talk about a blueprint for getting to 3 gigahertz. Of course, the big debate in the industry right now is FDX in one camp and 1.8 gigahertz in the other camp. So hey, why not mix it up a bit and look at the sky, which is 3 gigahertz. Of course, it's all about laying a roadmap to, if we're going to spend money on the plant, what should we be thinking about long term, and then how do we allocate the spend short term. This paper is a result of a collaboration between 3 companies, Cisco, Intel, and Qorvo. We've been working together for about a year and a half, working on this material and looking at where can silicon go, what can we actually build, and so the paper itself is about 51 pages. It's a really good read, and hopefully should provide a lot of input into the industry of what needs to be done. It didn't work. So let me set the why part of why would something like 3 gigahertz be interesting? I mean, why 1.8 sounds easier and it sounds more. Why would we ever need 3 gig? As we'll see later in the paper, the 1.8 gig plan has the equivalent bandwidth of DOCSIS 3.1 today. You know, if you look at the 3.1 and 1.2 gigahertz, it's 10 gig in the downstream. The 1.8 plan is less than 10 gig. It's around 10 gig in the downstream as well. So there's no real increase in downstream rates. It's targeted at increasing the upstream. Both FDX and 1.8 ESD, by the old name, are both upstream strategies, not downstream strategies. So how does this play out? Let's go to a market need. On the left here, we see a DAA node. So that could be a remote PHY, remote cloud CMTS, and you got to hook a fiber up to node. There's fiber on one side, RF on the other side. So what is that fiber that comes in? It's 10 gig. It's 10 gig point to point. So what do you got on the other side? Like if you have a 12 gigabit DOCSIS, it's not really going to help, right? Because you only have 10 gigs coming into a node. So 10 gigs is the key optimum point for today for any kind of DOCSIS spec. If you have 9 gigs, okay, not so good. 11 gigs, you just spent an extra gig that you didn't need. So that's the downstream. With FDX and with, depending upon where you go with 1.8 ESD, you can get 3 to 5 gig in the upstream. Arguably, if we did a 1 down, 2 up, that would completely fill the 10 gig fiber coming in, right? So we were used to thinking of DOCSIS in terms of just RF interfaces that come into a big chassis, and that chassis has hundreds of gigabits worth of bandwidth. But now, it's all wired, it will all be wired into nodes which have a fixed amount of bandwidth to them. So then that is the next question that comes up with, well, what's after 10 gig fiber? The answer is not 12 gig fiber or 15 gig fiber, it's 25 gig fiber. And we're not too far away from point-to-point 25 gig fiber being realistic. There's 25 and 50 gig PON technologies coming out in the next year or two that'll help bring the cost of the electronics down quite a bit. So if you had 25 gig fiber available to you, what could you do with it? And if you looked at the same type of strategy of 1 down, 2 up, well, wouldn't it be nice to have something that was 25 gig down and 10 or 12 gig up? That's what today's paper solves. All right, how the heck do you get more bandwidth out of something? I mean, we've been pounding this poor HFC plant for years. There's fundamentally 3 levers that you can play with to get more bandwidth. You can increase power, you can change the bit modulation, or you can change distance. So increasing power is really what we did for DOCSIS 1.2, DOCSIS 3.1, where we went to a 1.2 gigahertz network, and we just squeezed every little bit of power out of that node possible to make an N+0 plant work in the most cost-effective way. Those nodes are near meltdown. If we were to just take the same philosophy and extend it to 1.8 or 3 gigs, we get meltdown. So we're pretty much at the limit there, but that is what we did for DOCSIS 3.1. You could just take the power you've got and pound as many bits through it as you can. That's one of the proposals on the table for the extended spectrum DOCSIS, and that is just run up to 1.8 gig, and as you get attenuation, use lower bit loading. That's possible. That is a formula for lower throughput, however. And the third one is you change the distance of the plant. You move the amplifiers closer together so that the power will make it. We have a spin on that one. It turns out there's a lot of the amplifiers out there have pads before them, so there's power that's wasted in the field. So there's actually a power budget out there that can be taken advantage of. And why dump power in a pad where you can put it into some kind of performance that gets you something? But we have a spin on this third part about distance for the 3 gigahertz plan. So here is a typical segment. So we just covered the first theorem, like there's one of these 3 levers you have to pull. The second theorem is that there's no such thing as a 100-mile chunk of coax. There's a HFC plant that could be 100 miles. But really, the first 99 miles is fiber, the last mile is coax. And even in that last mile of coax, there's no 1-mile chunk of coax. There's really a whole bunch of short coax segments interconnected by passives and actives. Now, there might be an express feeder out there, but that aside, it's a whole bunch of coax segments popping up every 4th house hitting an active, a tap passive. So, if you were to look at it from a lab bench point of view, if all the coax segments are really on the order of a couple hundred feet, could you bring that coax in the lab and run it at 3 gigahertz? If you have a good 3 gigahertz piece of test equipment, yeah, you can. Now, if there's a hole inside the cable, okay, there might be something like that, but the raw cable itself generally can be pushed to 3 gigahertz. So our idea basically was to use distributed gain amplification or distributed power amplification, where we put smaller amplifiers in between bigger amplifiers. So as you look at this diagram, if you ignore the blue and you look at the taps, you'll see a node or an amp feeding a span that then goes to the next node or amp. So the idea is everything below 1.2 gig or 1 gigahertz, whatever your cutoff frequency is, leave that gain plan the same. I mean, it works today. Don't bother changing it. And then build a new gain plan for 1 gigahertz to 3 gigahertz with a new amplifier distribution system. Right? So then that frees you up to do something different from the 1 to 3 gigahertz range than below the 1 gigahertz range. And there's some very interesting tricks you can play once you start looking at that. So if you go back if you're going to put an amplifier in there that's 1 gig to 3 gig, you have to put it somewhere. We're not too sure how it'll get packaged. It could be a separate amplifier that goes in line with the taps, or it could be with the taps. It may turn out that when you put together the gain plan for the high frequency and the low frequency, that the amplifiers always are at tap 20 and tap 11. Maybe that's how it turns out. And so maybe by putting the amplifier inside the tap, it eases installation, right? Or it may turn out that you still have to fiddle around with the network, and you maybe have multiple 20s and whatever, so you don't know where it is. So maybe it's separate. In the paper, we called it a extended spectrum amplifier. And if you put that inside of a tap, it was a hybrid active tap. These are all just kind of placeholder names to kind of get the concept across. And then what we did is we said, all right, if you've got an amplifier there, the top part is an active path and the bottom part's a passive path. And we use a diplexer to separate the 2 spectrums. And the interesting thing about that is if the amplifier fails, you still have the lower spectrum. So it still has very high HA. Like everybody worries about putting actives in the field. If we had amplified the entire spectrum, you could argue the reliability went down. Well, here it stays the same. Now that putting a diplex at either end doesn't mean we need a transition band. And so I'm going to show some frequency plans in a few slides that says, well, here's a transition band we introduced. Here's how it can be applied in your network planning. The other thing that we found is when we took a look at the taps, the big question is, can I take a tap that was designed for 1.2 gig and run it at 1.8 or 3 gig? And in the end, you can't. There's some taps in the field that you could blast your way through with lower modulation, but at least half the taps in the field drop out around 1.4 gig, sometimes 1.25 gig. And if you're doing an install, which half of the plant works and which one doesn't? And do you really want to go around test taps in the field and miss one? You probably have to do a wholesale replacement of taps. So it turns out it's the seizure pin in the taps to set up a nice low-pass filter around 1.4 gig. And so essentially the pin, the pin comes in, hits the coax like this, so you have a limited amount of contact. So that's what kills you around 1.4 gig. What you need is a new system that goes like this. You have more contact area between the pin and the coax, and that'll get you to 3 gig. So we prototyped that. We got a bunch of 3 gigahertz taps up and running, put them into some field trials with some of our partners. The net of this, and probably the one takeaway from this presentation today, is when you upgrade your plant to 1.8 gig, put in 3 gig taps. Don't put in 1.8 gig taps or 2 gig taps. 3 gig taps from the get-go, because the other takeaway from this is we'll be able to build 3 gigahertz equipment one day. It's just silicon. It's power amplifiers and it's modulators. The silicon's going to hit 3 gig. It's the plant that needs to be ready for 3 gig. So 3 gig taps. Here's the other thing, and there's a lot of discussion around this in DOCSIS 4.0, is if you take the tilt that you have from, let's say, 108 to 1218, and you just extend that tilt out, you end up with a power-hungry node melting scenario. So there's got to be some way of playing around with the power, and we've got a bunch of different ideas floating around the DOCSIS 4.0 committee of doing it. One idea is to go flat. The other idea, one of our members of our team is doing is just to drop everything down 10 dB and then go with the tilt out to 1.8. None of those really work for 3 gig. So what do you do? And so what we have is the advantage is putting these separate L amplifiers out there. So we don't need as much power to get from the 1 amp to the next amp. We're much lower power. As a matter of fact, we're distributed power. So each of the amplifiers actually takes very little power to drive the amplifier. So we literally could set up 2 types of spectrum, one that's high power that goes, 7 or 8 taps, one that's low power that only has to go about 3 taps, and each of them would have a tilt. Then the next question is, all right, that green part, I need power. I need some TCP, some total composite power to move over there. If I can't add any power to the node because it's near meltdown, what do I do? Well, you can steal from the lower curve. Instead of having a cutover at 1218, maybe the cutover is at 1 gig, or maybe lower. And it turns out as you move that down, and the ETB is the extended spectrum transmission band, as you move that down, you're actually lowering the power of the whole system. And that's kind of interesting. So let's take a look at how that plays in. Oh, one more thing. If you go above a gig, you might run into something called MOCA. This may or may not be a problem for people. You can basically think of DOCSIS as a nice radio interference coming from the hub to the house, and MOCA is radio interference coming from the house back out to the plant. Now, if the house has been wired with a MOCA filter, it's not a problem, but not everybody has MOCA filters on there. So if you start taking out people's MOCA, you're going to get trouble calls. So at this point in time, everybody's just been avoiding the problem. In theory, it's a solvable problem. So what I did is I went in, I read through the MOCA specs, and I put together some ideas in the paper that if we basically put a gap in our downstream band, and you can fill the gap with an OFDM channel that you could turn on or off. We put a gap there of about 200 megahertz or so. You could fit in one 50 megahertz MOCA 1.1 channel or 150 megahertz 2.0 channel. One of the specs, the SCTE specs, recommends a 25 megahertz guard band. So you could make it, you could steer MOCA into a blank piece of spectrum. So that is part of the frequency planning. Let me skip the definitions. I'll cover that as I go. So I've got about 4 or 5 different spectrum plans. And being the cable industry, I thought a really long name, 3 gigahertz with such and such a cutoff, it wasn't working too good. So I named them things. I took the key from the video side of our industry. So this is the premium plan. In the premium plan, we get you everything you've ever wanted and more. So this is the only plan I'm aware of that can actually deliver 25 gig down and 10 gig up, right? This is the capture all of everything. So if we look in here, we see an upstream. The solid green is the FDX upstream of 108 to 684. Now, if you're doing ESD, of course, the downstream starts below this, so it's not really an FDX band, it's just a regular band. But if you're doing FDX, you get to pick up this part of the spectrum. So the stuff in fuzzy lines is the FDX part. Now, in the spec, FDX only goes to 684. But if we were to develop an extended version of FDX, which we think is possible if you can introduce powering into the plant, and notice that's exactly what we're proposing, is powering, extra powering the plant. Let's say you could extend FDX up to 1218 or some frequency like that. And then, of course, if you put FDX there, the downstream would have to be FDX. And then after the transition band, you've just got this big honking downstream right here from 1400 to 3000. So if you add up everything that's in the green, you can see standard FDX, extended FDX, so you'll see this in each slide. The upstream is 5 gig or 10 gig. Downstream gigabits per second is 20 with FDX off and 25 with it on, or 15 and 25, because here you don't have FDX. So, sorry, here you do have FDX, but you got more upstream bandwidth. So if you turn FDX off, it drops down. So here you have 25 down and 10 gig up. I think this is the ultimate goal, right? I think this is what technology permits and where we could march to. But we are not, I should say, we are not currently, there's no current work at Cable Labs right now to do an extended FDX. We're still trying to decide in the industry whether FDX is the right design decision or not. All right, let's back off from this a little bit. Let's take that transition band and move it down to 1100 to 1300. MOCA kicks in at 1100. So in this previous one, you can steer MOCA into this ETB right here. But if I was to say, all right, I'm not too worried about 10 gig in the upstream, maybe I don't even have extended FDX, I'm just going to optimize around MOCA. And also by moving the transition band down, I can save some power. So then here's the rates. You get a 25 gig down and maybe 8 gig up. So this, I think, is a pretty interesting one to kind of go do. Now, if I was to say, well, that's saving power is kind of interesting. What if I do some kind of legacy plan? I mean, if my plan only goes to 1,000 today, I have no video above 1,000, I have nothing above 1,000, how about if I drop my transition band there to save more power? So this is the calculation on that. Again, 25 gig down, 17 to 25, depending upon whether you have FDX or not, and then a smaller upstream. Now, at this point in time, MOCA is still above 1,100, so this is no longer optimized for solving MOCA. This is optimized for power. And if you went really to the extreme, if you said, I want to save as much power as possible, I'll do my transition band at 684. It turns out right between 684 and 804 is the FDX transition band. There's a filter in the FDX modems. So there's a game we could play where we basically say we're kind of screwing this part of the spectrum anyway. We'll put two things on it, and then in there goes video. And as a result, we've stolen power from the lower band, moved to the upper band, and we've lowered the power envelope on the entire plant. Just for comparison, here's what 1.2 gig full duplex DOCSIS looks like, so you can compare the charts in the paper. Here you basically have spectrum from 804 to 1218, the full duplex transition band, and then whether or not the upstream is on or off. This gives you 10 gig down and 5 gig up, and when you go to 1.8 gigahertz, this just shovels over. And you can see that 1.8 gigahertz is 10 gig down, 3.6 up. And that 10 gig down assumes that you can keep the same bit modulation through here. If you have to lower your modulation, it's less than 10 gigs. All right, so we are putting a lot of effort into 1.8 gig and potentially getting lower throughput when we're done. Now, if we took the 1.8 gig and extended that to 3 gig one day, you can see that that can jump from a 10 to up to 22. So there is significant gains to be had for either FDX or ESD. By the way, on the naming convention here, I've got legacy spectrum and extended spectrum. So Jeff was talking about extended spectrum, which is ESD, is a bit of a problematic nomenclature. Well, the legacy spectrum, DOCSIS, would be LSD. And we had that, we started off with that, we figured, oh, that's even more problematic, so. Although the spectrum on LSD probably doesn't mind us stealing power from it to feed the ESD spectrum, so that could be a benefit. Oops, that was I put a summary table in the paper of everything we just saw, so you can see all the different plans with FDX downstream on. With FDX on the downstream, we can nail at 25 gig, 10 gig today, and you see the speed rates of the different plans that I showed you. Should anything change in the PHY? You know, this is some good work that Intel did. We have to build new silicon, really, to go above 1.2. I mean, 1.8, we're kind of trying to do with existing silicon. 3 gig definitely is different. And it is a higher frequency, so the team did a fairly extensive study. Generally, they said keep everything the same. Like, one of the questions is, should we have bigger OFDM channels? Instead of 192, should it be 384 or twice that, 576 or something? We basically decided to keep the channel size the same. The symbol lengths were the same. Maybe some change in the cyclic prefix could be pretty interesting. There was a difference in the phase noise at the higher frequencies that has to be accommodated in the spec. So there's a little bit of work, but luckily not a lot of work that's involved there. Then I think the really important question is, can you actually build this stuff? Like, can you really build a 3 gigahertz amplifier? We all know the struggles it was to go from, you know, in the lower frequency from 550 to 750 and stuff, but a 3 gig amp? So Corvo, we worked with Corvo and they did a simulation. They've simulated and prototyped 1.8 gig silicon. And so they simulated 3 gig silicon. And the simulations show it can be built. It's not built today, there's no market. No silicon will be built before a market shows up. But they ran through the simulations, the results are in the paper, the different biases that they chose are all in the paper, and the net one of it is it can be built. When the world is ready, the silicon will show up. So takeaways from this whole thing. A 3 gigahertz plant is possible. It really is. 25 gig is probably not what we need today, and we might be shooting a little bit too far to build it immediately as our first goal. But 1.2 and 1.8 gig are great initial building blocks. And most plants have not even upgraded to 1.2 gig. Most plants are a gig and less. We have a 1.2 gig node and a 1 gig node, and the 1 gig node sells like big time, and the 1.2 gig node hardly anybody buys. It's one of those things that was supposed to be a big seller, but really everybody ends up just buying 1 gig nodes. So we have a long ways to go with existing building blocks, but we should plan the way with the future, and I think, of course, the bottom line there is the taps. So design for 3 gigahertz when possible, but deploy what's available. Use 3 gigahertz taps when upgrading taps. If you have to put in new chassis and new seizure pins, that'd be good to be 3 gig. So it's a pretty good bet that the node enclosures and amp enclosures out there today don't go to 3 gig. It's questionable whether they even go to 1.8 gig because of the seizure pins. So if you have to put a new chassis in, or if you're designing a new chassis, do it to 3 gigahertz, and then drop in 1.2 gig or 1.8 gig electronics. Right now, FDX and ESD are independent orthogonal technologies. Personally, I think that once 1.8 gig technology becomes prevalent, or even 3 gig, FDX will be an option we want to turn on or off. So I don't think we can look at them in isolation, but I don't think it's too hard to have coexistence with them either. So a 3 gig, 25 gigabit, 3 gigahertz, 25 gigabit down, 10 gigabit up HSC plant with distributed power amplification is within technology reach, and really I think is the next term goal after 1.8 gig. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. So now we got to figure out how do we
Escape out of that thing.
escape out of it.
And then,
Oh, and then it goes right to the front.
let's see, what did I do? Well, I had this all figured out
Please talk
yesterday.
amongst yourselves for a
So,
moment.
let's see if this works. No, that didn't work. Oh,
See, it didn't quite go the way they.
yeah, it didn't quite go. There, oh,
There we
escape,
go.
that escaped.
Oh, you got to escape. It's a double escape.
Yeah, there you go. It's like getting out of the insane asylum. You have to escape a couple of times.
There's a movie about that, actually. So before we get going, for those of y'all standing in the back, if you'd like to sit, we have plenty of seats. So just briefly, if you got a seat next to you, would you raise your hand so people know where they are? Plenty down front. If you want to pretend to be a sound engineer, we got plenty of seats here. You know, we're a cable gang. You know, nobody bites or smells too bad. You know, we put the fun in dysfunctional. So, you know, if you want to stand, totally cool. But But if you're anywhere near my age group, that ain't happening, so. All right, sweet. So, moving on, we got Steve Condra up next. And Steve's, believe it or not, by his youthful countenance, been in cable about 35 years. Has been involved, I remember, from the Lucent days in Scientific Atlanta, now with a company called Teleste, who is big in the outside plant space. Steve's been doing this stuff for a long time, and has been involved in the remote PHY development, and now is focusing on helping U.S. cable operators get us towards this, towards the space that we're all moving towards in the hymnals of DOCSIS 4.0. So with that, let me introduce Steve Condra.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I have been in the outside plant business for quite some time, the first 15 or 16 years in the twisted pair telephony space, and the next 20-plus years in the HFC space. And, I forgot my notes.
You can use mine.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. John Chapman and I worked together for more than 10 years, and I could fill my entire time with just John stories. But one of my biggest nightmares was having to follow John in a speaking engagement. I would wake up in cold sweats at night thinking, oh, God, I got to go after John. So welcome to my nightmare.
Just call me Alice.
Yeah. But John's been really good in the space, and he always focuses at much further horizon than I would. And I remember multiple times coming to John saying, hey, John, I got a great idea. And he'd say, yes, I wrote about that in 1997. And he'd find the notes for me that he wrote about in 1997 that had my exact idea already documented. So I normally focus a little closer in with projects and products and architectures that are more in the space of 3 years out. And John does a great job of looking 5 years and beyond. But with that, I think we're working on a really great industry. And what's even more exciting is we're working in a really great media, HFC. I mean, think of that for just a moment. We take the best of the fiber world, which is transmitting signals, and we combine it with the best of the coax, or the copper coax world, which is splitting signals, and we put them together in an HFC architecture. And that, in my opinion, is second to none in terrestrial architectures. And I've enjoyed all the time. However, a few years ago, we could have polled this room, and I think every one of us would have told ourselves that coax amplifiers were dead. I had multiple customers tell us that they would never buy another coax amplifier to upgrade, and that space had seen the last of the coax amplifiers. Here we are, and coax amplifiers are raising their hands saying, we ain't dead yet. So, which is exciting. I do think I'm very bullish on not just the industry and the HFC architecture in general, but I'm very bullish in moving beyond the 1.2 gigahertz spectrum that we're in today. It is a different world, though. I mean, if you go back 10 years when we were designing amplifiers for 750, there was lots of variables, but there was only a couple you had to keep track of. If you took care of CSO in the fiber, and you took care of CTB in the copper, everything else would work its way out. And it's a different world today. We're no longer doing analog video, and we're doing much better with some of our error correction, moving from Reed-Solomon to LDPC, and now we need to keep track of more categories as far as distortion and nonlinearities in coax amplifiers. So today it's more about MER and BER and TCP. TCP obviously being total composite power. But in the past, like we talked about earlier, when we moved from one set of spectrum to another, we kind of beat on the amplifiers and just added TCP. And if you could get total composite power and you could stay on the same slope as we'd had before, you had that perfect drop-in upgrade where you didn't have to change the spacing on the amplifiers, you didn't have to add any new amplifiers, you could drop into the spacing that we've had for some time. And so since the 550 days, there have been a lot of systems that have been stretched from 550 to 750 to 1 gig and beyond. And we did that by just adding total composite power. As John mentioned, we're kind of at a place today where just adding total composite power is not going to fix it. It's not available. In addition, we're not adding another 120 megahertz like we've done in the past. We're trying to add 600 plus megahertz of spectrum. So just adding total composite power is not going to solve that equation any longer. It's not available. In addition, as that slope gets higher, it's harder to add channels on the right-hand side of that slope than it is on the left-hand side just because of the slope and the signal. So what we've done is we've actually both simulated and tested actual product. And this chart's a little bit of an eye chart, but on the left-hand side is MER, on the right-hand side is bit error rate, and across the top is total composite power. And it was a much busier chart earlier, and we've simplified it down. The different colors are different frequencies of test. The top one is a 699, I believe, and the bottom is 1.7 gigahertz. And as is probably predictable, the higher frequency is the hardest to linearize. And in this particular case, we're showing where we've been able to take, at the time was a TCP part of 72 dBmV, and get 40 MER and bit error rate above 1 to the -8th, and get reasonable performance, linearized out to about 1.8 gigahertz. That gives us encouragement, not only with the part that was tested, but also with some other parts that have come on, have become available since the tests were done. We have now most recently tested a 75 dBmV part, and there's probably maybe another half or dB to go. We think we can get a 76 dBmV part that is linearized with acceptable performance out to 1.8 gigahertz. So we think that with this technology, we can make amplifiers available in the next 12 months that would enable a 1.8 gigahertz drop-in replacement in the same spacing without adding new amps, without adding additional active locations. We can drop in a 1.8 gigahertz amplifier. So how do we do that without additional TCP? Well, there's a couple of things that are going on. The first is, as John mentioned, most of this additional spectrum is going to be used in the upstream. So there's some TCP that comes off the left-hand side of the chart. In addition, most of these networks architecture, we're going to get rid of the splitter in the home and make this a gateway. And so we pick up a few dBs of loss by not having the splitter loss in the home. And the third idea on how we can take the available TCP and spread it out over a 1.8 gigahertz network is to keep the exact same levels we have today up to 1.2, so we're backwards compatible to any drop or any house with the legacy devices, CPE devices. But above 1.2, step down the power, like John mentioned, and take advantage of the fact that the 3.1 spec has much better modulation choices and much better forward air correction. So take advantage of the fact of using LDPC and still get acceptable modulation performance, even though we're hitting the CP equipment at a lower RF input. The advantages that we've gotten with the work we've previously done with 3.1 and having that dynamic modulation capability and being able to dynamically change the input and use the modulation available, as opposed to the old days where you had to take the lowest common denominator as far as modulation and make everything meet that minimum. Today we've got the ability on a CPE by CPE basis to modulate correctly and get an acceptable number of bits through the system. Like I said earlier, there's no magic TCP device available today that's going to solve this problem like we have in the past. So what we're doing is taking the total composite power that's available and using it to best of our ability out to 1.8 gigahertz. What's that look like in a cascade? Surprisingly enough, the actual performance shown in yellow and the theoretical performance shown in red tracked pretty close. There was a few differences, but they weren't great enough to give us any concern. So we feel confident that a node +3 and or node +4 architecture, and we'll show you some results of those, the cascade calculations on that, in a 1.8 gigahertz system can be built and give more than adequate performance. So there's a couple methods on how to do the back off. I personally prefer method 1, but I'll show you both. We have a remote PHY system today that has been proven, and I think we should take advantage of it. And so we could back off the signals at the remote PHY device in a way, and what we're showing these is in chunks of 96 megahertz chunks, because to some extent we are passing the buck a little bit on this problem to our brethren, the CPE. And so there's going to be some CPE, some cable modem changes required to go to 1.8, and so some of it we're going to ask them to participate in helping us solve the system issues with how to make this a usable system. But what this shows is we step down a few dB with each block of 96 megahertz, and then go back through an equalizer that would apply slope. And then by the time you go through the coax network, obviously, the input at the CPE is the same as it is today at frequencies below 1.2 gigahertz, and in incremental blocks of 96 megahertz above 1.2 gigahertz. So the cable modem change is required to address the fact that different frequencies could have different input levels, and with that, different modulation schemes for each of those channels or each of those blocks of frequencies. The plan at this point, or the vision at this point, would be the cable modem would have to have the ability to do that. The alternative to this, if you don't want to use the remote PHY device in order to do the back off, is method 2. It can be done in RF with filters, not nearly as incremental and as we did in the previous example. So in this case, we end up with a flat top on the signal at the node, and then a downward slope at the signal at the cable modem. That may actually be a little bit harder for the cable modem to adjust to, the fact that each block is not flat, but I don't think it's a problem that's necessarily not achievable as far as to take care of. This method 2 also has the disadvantage that it's not dynamic. In other words, if there's changes required, it's a physical change in the filter that's at the node. As opposed to the previous example with the remote PHY device, the output of the remote PHY device can be changed back at the head end. So taking a little bit of a look at what this might look like in a node 3, and the next chart is a node 4. Again, most of the increase, we're showing the MER values of at the node and the MER values after it goes to a node 3 architecture. And then in the blocks, we're showing the modulation of those. And we're close to 10 gigahertz, 10 gigabits in the downstream, but an additional quite a bit of increased spectrum in the upstream at 3.8 gigabits per second in the upstream. Similar results in the N+4 architecture. Both of these are showing the multiple steps of an RPD step down, but again, a similar performance in the amount of data speed available at the end of the cascade end of line using a node 3 or a node 4 architecture. So in conclusion, we think, and don't get confused between TCP of the actual device and TCP of the actual amplifier. They are a little bit different. There's a choke and a test point and a few other items to go through before you go from the device out to the amplifier. But a 76 dBmV output or total composite power hybrid should result in a 70 or 71 dBmV total composite amplifier. And we think with the parts that are available in the next few months that product is achievable could be built in the next 12 months. Again, two methods for stepping down the signals above 1.2. One is to do it with kind of remotely and dynamically with a remote PHY device, and the other one is to do it more statically with an RF filter, both of which give adequate results. The former is probably a little bit more flexible. We do believe that both the node 3 and the node 4 architectures can achieve 10 gig down and just a little bit short of 4 gigabits up, even with the traditional diplex filter that separate the downstream from the upstream. And there is one thing about this is though that it will be a lot more sensitive in the future than it has been in the past, and that is the accuracy of the alignment. We think that auto alignment and feedback tools in the amplifier to help with alignment would be very preferable and maybe necessary in order to keep the system aligned. We don't have as much headroom and as much power as we've had in the past, and we're kind of on the edge on some of the modulations that we're utilizing. So that technology is available today for feedback loops for doing alignment in the amplifier, and I think it's one that we should continue to move forward with. I do want to recognize some of my co-authors that are here in the room, particularly R2 and Carrie. This was not an effort on my own, and I want to thank them for help with this paper. So maybe my nightmare's starting to come to an end. Huh?
There you go, yeah.
Or maybe it's just beginning.
There you go, Jeff.
Yeah.
So we've got, you don't need this. We've got probably about 15 minutes for questions. Unless we've covered it they've covered it so clearly that there's no questions, and y'all are just champing at the bit to get out there and get this stuff moving. Got a microphone in the middle. Please step up to the mic, because otherwise you're going to be yelling it out, and then I just repeat it. We have our first victim.
All right, I'll start it off here. This goes back to John's presentation. First of all, thank you. My question relates to this MOCA band. The MOCA we make taps and passives.
Okay.
So we're concerned about the MOCA filter and how that works with the 3 gigs. You mentioned the steering. If you could just touch on that a little bit more for us. I get asked this all the time from our managers. Thank you.
So, sure, the question is how do you actually filter MOCA safely in the home? If good design practices are followed, then you have your drop cable coming into the home, and the first thing it's supposed to do is hit a splitter. It's supposed to be a 2-way splitter, but sometimes it's a 4-way splitter. But ideally, you hit a splitter, one leg goes to the DOCSIS cable modem, the other leg goes to the home where you have subsequent splitters and set-top boxes and all that. The reason we did that, of course, is to make sure we control the attenuation to the cable modem so we could get the DOCSIS signal to work. If you put a MOCA filter in the leg that goes to the home, that will basically, the home network can be whatever frequency it wants, but the filter caps it off at 1100 megahertz. So 1100 megahertz, anything above 1100 megahertz can't get in or out of the home leg. But anything above any other frequency can get out of the DOCSIS leg. So that separates the two. The only thing that breaks is if you want your cable modem to participate in the MOCA network. I see a MOCA connection on all the cable modems. I don't know if anybody's ever used it. That won't work, of course, because the RF path is fundamentally disconnected above 1100 megahertz. It's a lot of operators claim to actually put in the 1100 megahertz filter, which I think is a good thing. I don't think it's on my house. So I haven't found anybody's houses that it's actually on, but we'll see. We'll see when everybody starts using it. Yeah. Next question.
Hi, Ron Wolf from Charter Communications. I'm going to cheat a little bit and ask each of you a question. John, I think yours will probably be pretty quick. It's just, did you account for any reduced bit loading in the capacity model that you talked about with the 25 gigabit per second with 10 upstream? And then for Steve, I'm glad you brought up the level management. I'm a little concerned that as I look at the 76 dBmV output of the current amplifier technology, and that's kind of leaning over the cliff a little bit on getting into gain compression, and getting 70 dBmV or maybe 71 even to that output port is probably attainable in a node, but in an amplifier, you've also got to have some reserve gain for AGC because that temperature swing is going to get even worse at 1.8 than it is at 1 gigahertz today. How confident are you that you can actually get there?
All right, good questions, Ron. So in the 25 gig plan that I put together, we really basically have two different amplifier chains. Below a gig, you might have an N+2 plant. Above a gig, you'd have an N+6 plant because you get extra amplifiers. We're presuming that the amplifier design would be done in such a way that we can maintain full modulation up to 25 gigs, so there wouldn't be any reduced bit loading. But since you've asked the question, I should also disclose that in the 1.8 gig calculation, they're assuming reduced bit loading. And in my paper on calculations, I did not take their reduced bit loading into account. And I think there's an important point I'd like to take the opportunity to kind of make. We're used to thinking of 550, 750, 862, 102, 1.218 as downstream expanding technologies. We get more bandwidth in the downstream. Now we're going to 1.8. 1.8 is not a downstream strategy, right? It's an upstream strategy to get more upstream bandwidth. As we go from 1.2 to 1.8, we're probably going to end up with less bandwidth in the downstream than we have today, all right? So as we move into this direction, we have to make sure that that's okay, right? You have to say that, okay, we've got 10 gig today with 3.1. It's okay to drop it down to 8 gig because I'm willing to do that in order to get upstream performance. That, I don't think everybody kind of realizes is really the debate on the table. All right, over to you, Steve, for the other part of the question.
So we have done a lot of things to try to reduce the attenuation from the output block to the output of the node or the amplifier. And generally speaking, you're going to lose 3 to 4 dB from gain block to the output of the housing. In this particular case, we've got almost 6 in there, and part of that is to come off of the knee of the nonlinearity curve, and the other part of it is to come up with some gain for some of the AGC and other things that happen inside the amplifier. And that's why there's a 6 dB drop in the chart from 76 down to 70.
Next question?
Good morning. So you have had a lot of talk about the amplifiers and the loading and, you know, increasing the levels, but at the same time, has anybody done any work really looking at, you know, the business as usual, impedance mismatches within the system, you know, increasing the return loss so that we don't get the reflections and all the problems that we have to do with that? Are you going to get rid of all the squirrels in the world? Just looking at it as a, you know, operational perspective there.
I think you raised an excellent point. That's usually the stuff that guys in the field get hit with after we do all our designing on the optimum systems. No, I mean, I think the reality is as you go to 1.8 or 3 gig, there's a certain percentage of coax that just doesn't cut it because it's been damaged. It's got splicing in it. It just barely made it to what it's doing today, and it's going to have to get ripped out and replaced. And so I don't know what that percentage is. It would be great to have a study on that. In general, the coax that's out there today, the hardline coax, looks like you can run it at 3 gig. You just shorten the distance or increase the power on that particular segment, and you can get it there. The advancements are really in the silicon that can drive it and the electronics that can tolerate it. But yeah, there's probably a percentage of the plant. There's always a percentage of the plant that needs replacing, I think, when you do any upgrade. What we're kind of comparing it, though, to, as we do our studies, is we try to say, how do we get to 3 gigahertz? Really, we're basically trying to say, how do we squeeze more life out of the HFC plant without having to go to a fiber rebuild? Because once you can get 25 gig to the neighborhood in fiber, somebody's going to figure out how to do 25 gig to the home. It's just optics, right? And today, you know, when the fiber guys come along and say, I can do 10 gig to the home, our response is, great, we can do 10 gigs with DOCSIS. The fiber guys are going to come along, and you know, and it's a tough battle. We're in trench warfare right now, just with that argument, and we're on par. When the fiber guys show up and go, hey, I can do 25 gig to the home, what's the response going to be? We either roll over and die and pull fiber to the home, or we come back and we say, we can do 25 gig with the HFC plant. And that's kind of where the thinking is behind the 3 gigahertz. As long as there's less money than the fiber outlay, hopefully it's still a win.
Now, we've done 2 studies so far on various cable types, and we're not seeing a tremendous amount of cable so far based on the analysis done at Shaw in Canada and Cox in Florida. We've got more trials planned. I know that NBN in Australia is going to be doing a trial across their network. So we'll be gathering a lot more information on this. We haven't disseminated the results too far, but if you're interested in more details, I can point you to folks, you know, that could get into the details with you. So, next question. And there's nobody at the mic. So, my turn. So, from the perspective of timing, you know, we're talking about having the 4.0 spec done at least for the first issued release, like next February, March. How do you think how long do you think it'll take us to get to the point that we can start actually sort of completing our initial network designs and beginning some of that work to where we'll actually be able to use that spectrum?
I mean, I think anytime you get involved in a new product development, it's 3 to 5 years. I mean, the 1.8 gigahertz stuff is easy to wrap your head around, but at the end of the day, something critical happened in the plant somewhere around 1.2, and that is we coupled the DOCSIS development and the HFC plant development together at the hip. It used to be that we could rev the DOCSIS spec and not touch the plant. And revving the DOCSIS spec would take us 3 to 5 years for each new generation of DOCSIS. And then plant upgrades could kind of happen on a sporadic basis. So now we're talking about every bit of HFC equipment and every bit of DOCSIS equipment has to be revved together. So it doesn't matter if it's FDX or 1.8, you know, that whole food chain has to exist, right? And that food chain is DAA, right? You can't do this with a centralized CMTS because the optics don't pass 1.8 gig. So you have to install digital fiber. You have to do DAA, which changes your software operations. You got to have a new node that does FDX or 1.8 gig. You have to have new amplifiers. For 1.8 gig, you have to have new taps. You have to have a new cable modem. There's 5 or 6 moving pieces in the system, and I'm pretty sure those will disrupt a bunch of other things. So I think the bad news is it takes a lot of work to get product out in the field that's working, deployable, tested, and can scale.
And the one thing you didn't mention as well is test equipment.
And test
And
equipment,
we need-
yeah, there
we
you go.
need, yeah, analyzers.
Yeah,
I mean,
and training classes.
Training
Since we're
classes.
at SCTE, yeah.
Steve, any thoughts?
No, I mean, this is different than in the past. From an HFC perspective, we used to say, if we build it, they will come. And we did that going from 550 to 750, and again from 750 to 870. We could upgrade the plant and still use it in its previous mode. And this one is a little bit different in that while we have a strong desire to maintain backwards compatibility for all the devices that are already in the field, we're going to have the same issue here with when we change the diplexer to go to a higher split, is how do you prevent that from creating issues in the legacy homes, you know? And there's ways around it, but it takes a coordinated effort, and it takes a plan and a strategy on how to get there.
How do you think this compares to previous upgrades? Because now we're looking at, you know, originally the upstream was, when I started, it was like 30 megahertz. And then it was 42, and then others did 65, and now we've got 85, 204. So there's these changes all occurring kind of simultaneously. in terms of level of effort, how do you think these things compare?
Well, we live in a very exciting time with respect to the amount of change.
That ancient curse.
Yeah, that amount of change is possible. In fact, we used to tease John that we wouldn't let him go talk to customers because just when we think we had them convinced to buy something, he'd show them the next new thing, and they'd go into freeze mode and wait on the next new. And we've got that in spades today, going on in multiple different directions. John mentioned a little bit with FDX versus 1.8, now 1.8 versus 3, and at some point, there's a little bit of analysis paralysis going on, and everybody's kind of afraid to jump in any one direction for fear it might be the wrong direction. But I think that's actually worse now than I've ever seen it, as far as the amount. I mean, the best thing about HFC in the world is it's flexible. The worst thing about HFC in the world is it's flexible, okay? And it's both a blessing and a curse, and because we've got so many different directions we can go now than what we could in the past, now that we've moved the digital point out to the node, and we've got that very, very unique thing going on in the node that never happened in the past, and that is we've got power, we've got connectivity, we have a full digital signal for DSP capability, for digital signal processing, and that just doesn't exist that deep in any network in the world. And with that comes a lot of choices to make, and to some extent, we're all looking at all those choices and trying to make the right decision, and it's not easy.
Thanks. If no further questions, we are just about out of time. Thanks very much for coming up, and let's thank our speakers.